Hi there, and welcome to Next Frontier. My name is Thomas Andersen, founder and CEO of Responsibly, and Next Frontier is my show about sustainability in the supply chain. Today, I'm talking to Yann Chilvers. Yann has built a company called Covalo that's entirely dedicated to helping consumer goods companies design sustainable products. Now, that's really interesting for several reasons. I typically say that there are two ways to build a sustainable supply chain. One is to work on the supplier level, working with your suppliers and procurement to buy from the most sustainable suppliers. So if you need, for example, aluminum in your product, you find the most sustainable supplier of aluminum and you work with them to further improve. The other level is redesigning your product so you may not need aluminum in the first place, but can use a more sustainable material or ingredient or use even less of it. And that's what Yann knows really well. So that's what we'll spend most of the episode on. With that, we'll discuss everything from the product design process and how sustainability is integrated in that. And here Yann has some really interesting examples from the cosmetics industry about how challenging it is to change just one ingredient. We also discuss the trickiness of including sustainability in your product marketing towards consumers and the regulatory role. Consumers typically have very little bandwidth for complexity when buying products, but sustainability is very complex. So how do you balance that without the solution being a meaningless, sometimes, eco-label? There's lots more in the episode we discuss. This is a good one. Okay, Yann Chilvers, founder and CEO of Covalo. Here we go. How are you doing, Yann? It's good to see you.
Very good, very good.
Yeah.
Actually, we'll be recording a podcast of my own on Thursday, so it's a good friend.
What will that be about?
We started like a new series of really putting the spotlight on the people within the industry and the passion that they have.
Okay.
So sometimes you meet people along the way that have like a very unique story to tell.
Mm-hmm.
There's not something where we have like a set cadence. It's more like when we meet people.
That's exciting.
Like actually a Dutch couple that quit everything to move to Indonesia and try to save a bit the rainforest with like an entire project. So they started initially like 11 years ago, thinking they would be like a 6 months project.
Mm-hmm.
And now they're like 11 years in. So it's very, very nice.
Wow. Still working on the rainforest.
Yeah. No.
That's
I won't
cool.
tell too much. I'll send you the link.
Yeah, do that. I'm looking forward to hearing that. I like those stories, That's part of why we did this as well. More relatable stories, hearing about kind of how people are trying to accomplish all of these things day to day.
Mm-hmm.
It's too often, and who are we to talk with two founders here? But it's too often that it's only like executives, CEOs, founders, investors, those kind of things that gets the spotlight, right? And that's just not always very relevant to, the people listening.
Yeah, I think like also one thing I find quite interesting is a lot of people start projects, but not everyone has the grit to, push through the difficult times.
Yeah.
And I think like you really need to have a strong conviction and passion to also weather like the hardship and so on. So this is always very interesting also to see people in very different industries, but starting something and pushing through. It's also bring a bit of solace as a founder sometimes.
Yeah, 100%. They often say that, right? I remember in business school, grit being as one of those characteristics that were associated with, founding great companies, but also success in general. I never really got it. I was like, what do you mean grit? I mean, what do you mean sticking with it? And isn't that easy? And then you try yourself and you just realize that, doing it over years and years and years, then it's a skill set almost.
It's difficult, but I think everyone has it within them in some way. But it's just you need to have the thing that really triggers it. And, it's also a lot about the environment, the project you're working on.
100%.
Yeah.
True. 100%. But Jan, welcome to Next Frontier.
Pleasure.
I'm super excited to talk to you today. As I often say, this setup gives me a little bit of an excuse to ask you questions I don't get to ask you when we normally meet up and chat.
Let's see if the connection will hold or throughout the interview, or if I need to find an escape.
Exactly. Oh, sorry, I'm driving through a tunnel. You cannot hear me.
Happy to answer some of them. Let's see if I can also contribute a bit to some of the reflections.
100%.
Also happy to get your perspective on some of the topics, because as we discussed, like in the past, we have like a very vertical approach, while you're trying to address like one of the topic across multiple industries. So to also hear about like stories in adjacent segments is always super interesting for us as well.
100%. No, that's super cool. And there's quite a lot I want to talk with you about today. So, you've built a company, Covalo, to specifically help companies, I guess, in the consumer goods industry to build and design more sustainable products, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
And I think that's super interesting. So that's all we're going to be talking about today. We're going to be talking about sustainability, product design, your learnings from just trying to do that from the technology side and creating a technology around it, but also just working with clients and potential clients on what do they need and so on. And I think there's quite a lot that's changed along the way. At least in our business, the last 3 years have been crazy, right? So much changing in the sustainability side. So I wanna hear all about that. But Jan, I'll start us off super soft, because one of the things I enjoy the most in this industry is that people, they kind of stumbled into sustainability from all, different angles of life. So I want to hear a little bit about you, Jan, because I've actually never asked you about that today. I know you worked in a similar-ish industry before, but how did you stumble into sustainability with Covalo?
Yeah, so I mean, like sustainability is always a bit of a buzzword. I think one thing that for me was always very important was mostly the topic of transparency, because I developed a quite strong allergy against all this greenwashing and people wanting to look good and then try to package it in a certain way. And I thought, like, if you give people access to all the information and facts and figures, then you can let everyone define what sustainable look like for them and how they want to do it. But at least they have all the information they need to take an educated decision. And so I started like in strategy consulting, then joined Clariant, which was one of the sustainability leader in the chemical industry. They're active like across multiple segments. And one of them was like consumer goods. It was personal care, everything related to cosmetic, and then home care, more product for like home appliances, cleaning product, and so on. And they saw that there were a lot of, let's say, projects being launched in the market that were putting the emphasis mostly on price and lead time, and not so much on the specialty side of the product, the sustainability aspect of the product. So they wanted to launch a form of Google for chemicals that would put emphasis on this, and that Clariant would start, but then I wanted to have like other players join that initiative. So it was really good to start that project in a larger organization, having access to customers, expertise, and so on. We quickly faced the problem was that most of our customers were competitors of Clariant, and therefore there was a certain reluctancy to engage with us. And during COVID time, there was also a lot of businesses focusing on their core business, not wanting to enter new ventures. And that's when we did like a management buyout with my co-founder, Timo. So that was back in 2021. And since the beginning, we really tried to put that sustainability, transparency element to the center, really trying to standardize the information to make it more comparable, making sure that we also verify a certain level of the information. Later on, we also want to leverage our community to raise certain issues, because we cannot verify everything ourselves. And that's also what made us enter in contact with you guys. I think that was 1-2 years ago, because also looking at getting additional information and data sources to try to have like the most exhaustive picture as possible.
Oh, that's super interesting. I actually forgot about that. I forgot that Covalo started in Clarion originally. You must have a ton of opinions then about, when does innovation work internally in big corporates and when do you need to spin it out in a startup?
Let's keep it for another podcast.
That's a big topic, isn't it?
Yeah,
But maybe so. Okay, so chemicals.
yeah.
We often come across that, right?
Mhm,
Chemicals. It's often one of the ingredients that goes into a lot of different types of
mhm,
products. So it's one of those places you look for sustainability, but
mhm,
help people understand that aren't familiar with the chemicals industry. What can you do to make chemical ingredients more sustainable? Like, how does that fit into the product design process?
mhm. Like if we take like a product like this one and you turn around, usually you see a list of what they call, you would see ingredient or INCI list,
Hmm.
which is a list of ingredients that come into that formulation. So if we look
Hmm.
at just person care, you have on average 20 to 30 ingredients in one formulation. And people would be putting on average 12 different products on or on their skin or in their bodies. So it's on
It's
average
crazy.
around 160 ingredients that people apply on their bodies daily.
Wow.
Um, when you want to launch a product like this, you usually go to the supermarket, you look at the product and you say, okay, you don't really think of what was the process behind to develop it. It typically takes 2 to 4 years to launch a product like this. So it's super long,
Hmm.
and it can involve like up to 15 different stakeholders. So when we think in terms of sustainability, the first thing that the brands will do is like they will develop a brief that will reflect a bit their view on the market and the opportunities that they see. So they would say, I want an upcycled product with a recycled packaging. I want to have this and this certification to sell it in that market. And then they would give this to the formulation, to the R&D team, that will try to find suitable ingredients under the constraint of regulation, under the constraint of procurement. And then you go through all the testing, the manufacturing, and so on. So when you look through this value chain, you have a lot of areas where sustainability comes into play. Number
Hmm.
one is what consumer are demanding. So if consumer are not asking for a sustainable product and not willing sometimes to pay premium for it, then brands will not be developing those products,
Hmm.
regardless of how high their convictions are. Number two, it's very difficult to find the right alternative. So sometimes you change an ingredient that is more sustainable, but the formulation is not as stable, or the packaging also has a lot of impact. So finding the right balance is quite tricky. We have today more than 80,000 ingredients on the platform. So just making it easy to find the right alternative is already supporting the brands a lot.
Hmm.
And then we have on the procurement and regulation side, like additional constraint that are set by the government or set by the internal procurement team that would usually look more on the supplier level, like what are the commitments, what are the good manufacturing practices, how close are the manufacturing side from the manufacturing side of the brands. And
Hmm.
so all those parameters ultimately makes a huge equation that we need to solve on the multiple constraints. And our goal in a certain way is to provide them the data and the tools to solve that equation as quickly as possible.
Awesome. That's super interesting. I want to pick that apart a little bit.
Mhm,
I remember you told me one thing last, which I never thought about, and maybe correct me if I'm wrong now,
mhm,
but I think you said something like, sure, you want to change your packaging to be more recyclable
mhm,
or, made from more climate friendly materials, etc. But maybe you then also need to change the formulation of your product
mhm.
because the current ingredients doesn't fit into that packaging
Yeah,
format.
exactly. So usually, like if you look a lot of those recycled packaging, they are letting a bit more air or light go through the packaging,
Hmm.
which means that it impacts the stability of the formulation. And so either you need to add some product like stabilizer, which are usually not 100% natural, or you run the risk of having a different texture, or the shelf life will be reduced. And I
Hmm.
think that's also something that sometimes consumers need to understand is you need to be willing to compromise on some aspect. It should be the price, should be the shelf life, should be the texture, but you cannot have it all. At least today, it's extremely complicated to have a price competitive product that is stable and that also has great performance. So.
Got it. Okay, so packaging is one element, right? Like we're all used to seeing those labels when we buy products. How else can an ingredient be more sustainable other than kind of facilitating more sustainable packaging?
I mean, like the choice of ingredients can have a big impact, but not only the ingredient, but also the origin of the ingredient. So if you
Okay.
look, for example, you can have one product that can be issued from different processes. So, for example, in Europe, you might get to that product by using gas. In China, you might be using coal. In the US, you might be using oil. And the same ingredient achieved through different processes can have like a carbon footprint up to 6 times higher. And there is one thing is like finding a more sustainable ingredient. And the second one is within one ingredient, finding the most sustainable origin.
Got it.
And then there is also all the supply chain and logistics. So you have like some product you can produce very locally and others, a lot of the naturals. Then when you have like tropical plants and so on, those usually don't grow in Denmark or Switzerland. So you have also like a certain carbon footprint that come from the supply chain side.
Okay, so that's like the carbon footprint. And I guess here we come into life cycle analyses and those kind of things, right? Estimating that type of product down to where it's being produced or that type of ingredient, and then finding out, okay, what roughly is the carbon footprint? And some ingredients will just have a lower footprint than others, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, like what we started now, we received last year a grant from the Swiss Agency for Innovation to work on the world first recommendation engine for sustainable alternatives. So carbon footprint is one, but there are other SDG elements that people may want to optimize for, labor conditions, pollution of soils, and so on. And that's again, I think, like the importance of emphasizing on transparency. And not so much on establishing a new standard for sustainability, because I think there are like a lot of people that establish different standards that just create more fragmentation in the industry where people don't really know what each standard mean. And so I think it's more important to give the brands the data they need to establish their own standard and communicate about it accordingly, rather than try to force one approach onto it. So if we take this into consideration, we might have like 15, 16 dimensions on which we assess suppliers and the ingredients. And then we will let the brands provide a certain weighting on what they try to optimize, what is a prerequisite and what is a nice to have. And therefore also then guide them through the ingredient selection according to those criteria.
And one of the things you mentioned, labor practices, right? One of the things that I find fascinating is that, what consequences do we want to have happening when we start doing this type of sustainable decision making? A very unfortunate conclusion can be, hey, we don't want to buy from high risk countries where there's high poverty, and hence there's a higher risk of child labor, forced labor, those kind of things. But that kind of makes the problem worse, right? Because now you're just moving money away from areas with high poverty, and then it's not like the child labor is going to go away, right? What like that kind of labor area? Because when you talk about human rights with product sourcing and ingredient sourcing, a lot of that must be based to the regions that those ingredients are coming from, right?
I mean, that's a very tough one to answer, right? I think there are different sensitivity about the topic, different vision. You have a lot of people that will apply their cultural view on the topic to something that may be very different on the ground in one of those countries. A lot of people want to also, it's a bit of a feel good element of it makes me feel uncomfortable to have something that use child labor in these conditions, and I don't want to understand like the background. It's just something that is wrong in the first place. I guess there are also difference, like a dramatic difference between what is forced and what is like a choice to sustain that family income.
Yeah.
I find it, this particular topic, I find it extremely tricky. I remember you had a post on LinkedIn addressing that topic and the implication on the welfare of families in some of those regions, and that it's like really a family effort, and that kids are pulled into this. Um, Again, I think like transparency is quite important. If you can educate people on what is the view of people on the ground, what are the implications in terms of development, if you show also how, for example, child labor doesn't come at the cost of education and therefore keep people probably in a lower class or income class because
Hmm.
they are not given the opportunity to upskill themselves. Uh, then I guess everyone can then take a decision based on what they feel comfortable with.
Yeah.
But it's a very, I guess it's a very personal question, and providing the right information and having a 360 view on the topic is, in my view, probably the most important thing.
Yeah. Like, I think what I would hate is if the results of all of this
Mhm.
transparency is that consumers just buy fewer ingredients from high poverty regions and then create less labor and those kind of things. Like, that would be such a terrible consequence, in my
Mhm.
opinion.
I think it's again the problem of oversimplification, and then the more standards you have, the more dimension you add, the less deep people are going in each one of them.
Hmm.
And you tend to go to like this black and white, like this is bad, this is good, this we do, this we don't do. The same with ingredient. You have ingredients that are can be harmful only within certain concentration,
Hmm.
but usually they're using concentration level that are completely harmless. But because people saw that this ingredient can have like endocrinal disorder consequences, I just stop it. But they don't always understand the implication of not using that ingredient. They don't understand what are the alternative. They don't understand, also the period of time on which it may have an impact.
Hmm.
And this is again a work of educating people, because you cannot force something on people if they don't truly appreciate it.
100%. And there's a lot of interesting nuances there. I have some friends in L'Oreal
Mhm.
where they talk about some of their, in the cosmetics industry, you see all of these small brands popping up locally,
Yeah.
and all of them, or a lot of them, will be advertising things like 100% natural ingredients and those kind of things. And the people I know at L'Oreal, they're like, but guys, this is EU regulation. Like, we're not even allowed to advertise that because this is the bare minimum. But the consumer doesn't know. So the consumer would be coming to them like, why do you guys don't produce your product like these small brands does? And they're like, we do. We're just not allowed to, talk about it. And they are, because they're tiny.
Yeah, I mean, it's a big problem. The big groups tend to have very high standards,
Hmm.
and that's also why they tend to take much longer to launch a product. So a big group would take those 2 to 5 years, while a smaller brand can probably launch much faster. A lot of the not all of them, I don't want to oversimplify, but you have some of the small brands that are mostly marketing engine. And so they will rely on a contract manufacturer that has some form of white label formulation that they can slightly tweak.
Hmm.
Usually you tweak the packaging, the fragrance, probably a bit the texture, but the rest is 95% common.
Hmm.
And then they put their brand on it, have like a community that they can spread the word in. Um, it's usually not where the true innovation is taking place. Again, there are exceptions. You have like former R&D lead of big groups that launch something very niche,
Hmm.
where they are the one formulating. But today, if you look at those indie brands, a lot of them, not all of them, but a lot of them are rather marketing engine and not always very science backed. And
Super
but
interesting.
it's also the end consumer is very responsible for this, right? So
Yeah.
when people go and buy their toilet product and they just see a little frog with a green leaf, they feel good. How many people are really able to explain what that label means, what are the implications, how this product differ from another product? People don't usually go to that depth,
Hmm.
and therefore brands are giving people what they're asking for. So that's I was in the US, everything is organic. Uh,
Hmm.
but if you have a synthetic ginger extract, you can create it on site with no chemicals, no pesticides, nothing. You have low carbon footprint for logistic. You need it's very concentrated, so you need much less water,
Hmm.
and you have a very high quality product. While if you wanted to get to the same result with actual ginger, you would get all the pesticide with it. You would need absolutely outrageous amount of ginger for it, which don't end up in the food chain. And then you would have also a cost that would be probably 50 times the cost of the synthetic option, although the performance would be the same or lower than the synthetic one.
That's a good example. That's fascinating. I didn't know about that.
I mean, we try to do quite a lot of, we have a lot of very niche suppliers that are super innovative, like biotech companies.
Mm-hmm.
And the initial problem that a lot of them face is that there is no awareness for the problem they're solving. And so you cannot sell something if people are not educated to appreciate it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so that the first step that we usually take with them is to create like marketing campaigns to really address the topic, educating consumers, and then slowly drive them through the sales funnels to convert them into customers. But usually, if you try to push it too hard at the beginning, it's very difficult.
That's fascinating, and that leads me into what does consumers actually want? Because this topic, as you and I know very well, Yann, is just insanely complex. There's so many angles to it. We talked about just before what does sustainability actually mean?
Mm-hmm.
What do you think consumers are pushing for? Do they just want to buy something with a label on, and then we need to regulate as governments what those labels can say, and then that's kind of it? Or what are you seeing on your end?
It's also a tricky one. I think it depends a lot from one country to another. So sometimes it's also a rich world problem. You go to we were in Venezuela for New Year's Eve, and you have people living off $5 a month, where a can of Coke is $3.
Mm-hmm.
Sustainability is not really a concern for them, right? It's survival number one,
Mm-hmm.
and then it's the question of having a cosmetic product or not, and then comes the question of packaging, sustainability, and so on. So there are a big part of the world where people just cannot really afford making it a topic, and there is also not that same sensitivity for the topic.
Mm-hmm.
And then if you look, let's say in probably Western markets, you have people with very, very strong convictions and that are willing to do a lot of sacrifices for these convictions. A lot of people would still have a trade-off where it's important, but not at all price. And it's important, but the level of involvement and education work that they are willing to go through to really take the right decision is also limited. So I would say that governments have a key role to define standards that are not just marketing driven, but really scientific and with a good rationale.
Mm-hmm.
Then we need to find a way to make this easy to understand, but we need to also pay really attention not to oversimplify, because then we run again the risk of fostering the wrong behavior on the brand side, and just to make the consumer feel like, oh, I did my share, I paid 20% more,
Mm-hmm.
it had a great label, and now I'm good to go.
Like we do with organic today, right? If we can afford it, it feels better at the supermarket if we only buy organic.
Yeah, I mean, for food, it's different, but like for cosmetic, might not be better.
Mm-hmm.
In some cases, it's the case. In other cases, it's not. And so this idea of, oh, I do all organic because organic is better, and it's again very black and white when
Mm-hmm.
the reality is many shades of gray. And I think that's just I don't see many consumers willing to analyze those shades of gray, and they rather stick to an easier black and white approach, which is a good start. I think you need to start somewhere. But over time, the level of education of the consumers should increase. And with this, the demand or the expectation toward brands, and therefore the brands will have high expectation towards suppliers, which will have higher expectation toward like raw material providers, and that supply chain transparency that we've been talking quite a lot about is something that will come out of this. If
Mm-hmm.
everyone holds the previous stakeholders as responsible for everything that happens before them, then you end up in a better spot.
Yeah, that I can 100% get on board on. I'm just still trying to rack my brain on how much can the consumer actually make a decision on realistically. Like even now when you're starting to put, product carbon footprint numbers on products, and you can look behind a, package of milk and you can see the CO2 number,
Mhm.
even though that's just one thing, is that already there too complex? Do we need to go even more simple? Like I heard from some friends the other day that they say, when we buy mangoes, we only want to buy mangoes from Spain and not all the way from Latin America, because then we know the footprint is smaller, right?
Yeah.
Which is fair.
The next question is whether you should have mango in the first place.
That's probably, but then you got to make life changes, right? Which less people are happy to do.
Yeah. It's again, I think small steps are already going a long way, and we
Mhm.
always need to find then adjust. I think we see this in many areas where there's been sometimes a move a bit too much to an extreme, and then over time we go back to a certain normal.
Mhm.
I think this is very important. I think like we need to pay a bit attention today also what do we take as a source of trustworthy information. There was an article recently showing how the Gen Z is aging differently than millennials because
Mhm.
and they look at like on TikTok at videos of 30, 40-year-old influencers talking about retinol product, which is absolutely not suitable for teenagers. And now
What's that? What's that a kind of a product?
it's a quite potent anti-aging ingredient
Okay.
that can also lead to hypersensitivity of the skin. You should not wear it at any point in the day, so rather in the evening before you go to bed, not in the morning because of the impact like daylight could have on it. But all this education on not having too high concentration, when to wear it, as of what age, what are the implications. This is not conveyed in those very short videos. And then you
Mhm.
have 14-year-old that go and buy 300 euro Shiseido creams with very good formulation, but just for older people.
Mhm.
And that's just absolutely not suitable for them. So I think that's also like for many topic, politics, consumer behaviors, ideology, everything. And we need to pay attention also on how information is being conveyed and what people trust and base their decision on. Because now that's one area where I would see quite a lot of risks.
Mhm. Interesting. It reminds me of another study I read, which surprised me in some of its conclusions, because it basically said two things that surprised me. One, it showed that there was a lot higher maturity in some Asian countries
Mhm,
on taking sustainability into account in decision making. I did not think
mhm,
about that, and there's a nuance there that I'll share later, which why that is. But there was a lot of kind of focus on that, and we normally think about Europe, US,
mhm,
that must be where it is at. But there was a lot of focus on it in Asia, but it was for a different concept. And then the second conclusion was actually the new generations are not as sustainability minded as we think. Like there wasn't a huge difference in the sustainability demands from, baby boomers, our generation, and kind of the newer generation, as I would at least have assumed. So some of those numbers are also quite interesting.
mhm. I mean, we see in the search pattern on the platform, like what people are looking for. So we did see in Asia, like actually a lot more searches using sustainability claims and certification than in Europe. So that's something we also saw.
Interesting.
And you have like some hubs that are very, very strong. So Japan, Korea, are, for example, very famous for a super high quality product.
Hmm.
You have like an entire concept of K-beauty also that is very strong. For the rest, yeah, it's difficult. I mean, like for example, when we send an email to set up that call or the recording that we're having now, we don't really look at the carbon footprint of it, right? It's
Hmm.
so intangible that you don't look into it. And we receive hundreds of email per day, which actually have a super high carbon footprint. When you use Google versus EcoAsia, for example, you also have a carbon footprint that it's much higher. So it's also like what do we on on what kind of impact people have awareness and what are the things we overlook.
Hmm.
This is also like a big factor. Oh,
That's interesting. It's very interesting. You saw it with Asia as well. What
mhm,
that study basically ended up concluding was it's because the definitions of sustainability also vary. So like it even found differences in the US between voters. So the Democrats sustainability would be all about emissions. So they would be hyper focused on that. Whereas the conservatives would have a broader definition of sustainability. It would also include water usage and those kind of things. So I thought that was interesting. And then it showed in Asia, it was actually more about circularity. So it was more about durability of products, making sure that they can be repaired, making sure that they can be recycled, those kind of things, that there was those sustainability dimensions, which also sort of makes sense, right? Especially if you talk about some of the poorer nations in Asia, durability is just an important value proposition in general that is then also sustainable.
Yeah. I think that's culturally it's super important. We probably have a bit more this fast consumer culture in Western markets. I guess there is also another thing is like, where does the pollution take place? So you buy something like, let's say, an electric car. It does not emit much emission where you use the car, so it's great. But probably created a lot of pollution and emission in other countries. So it's also that concept of through certain actions that look sustainable, you just outsource the pollution to another country or to another stakeholders, and in a certain way de-responsibilize yourself from it. So it's also like, as you were mentioning, like that full life cycle analysis, how far people look and how uncomfortable it is sometimes to look a bit further. A lot of people just stop at their level, what they can control, but don't always go much deeper.
Yeah, you'll have the conflict minerals from a mine somewhere in Asia, and then the car will end up in an e-waste dump in Northern Africa or something like that, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Do you see circularity coming up more and more in product design?
We see a lot of upcycle. So we did like an entire campaign on upcycling. This is something like suppliers are talking quite a lot about, and we see more and more product coming from there. On the consumer or the brand side, there are sometimes still certain misconception that it's lower quality. That this idea that you're doing a product out of waste, it cannot be the same quality. And it's actually not true. You have like a super expensive product, super high quality. And there again, it's a question of educating people. The technologies and the possibilities are there. And now it's more about generating the demand for it to make sure that it picks up.
Can you explain upcycling to the listener who doesn't know what it is?
So, for example, you would have a product, you would have a tomato juice, and you would have the skin and the flesh of the tomato that would be like a leftover or byproduct of that production. And they can reuse this byproduct to then generate, for example, an active ingredient for cosmetic. And so it's giving like a second life to that waste to make sure it doesn't just go to the landfill, but it has like a second purpose and value. And then we see also quite a lot around packaging. So you see those reusable packaging where you have a nice shelf that you can keep, and then you can just change the cap. Or you have like also move toward like more, that's not circularity, but we have like solid cosmetic. That is also a big topic where ultimately you can reduce the amount of water used, you can reduce the logistic and so on. There are a few problems with this. For example, the cream I use has these caps that you can change, but when you go to the pharmacy, you can't buy the refill. You need to buy it all again. So that's also sometimes it looks great on the package, but then when you get to that second step of refilling, then it doesn't work. And then a lot of people also don't want to compromise on the texture. So if you talk about solid cosmetic for soap is fine, but like for I don't know, like shampoo, that's something that people rubbing their head with like a solid shampoo bar is still something that is a bit uncomfortable, and then it's wet and sticky. So how do you carry it? So when you travel, it's also not always super easy. So you have like a lot of small challenges that pave the way and probably hinder a bit the adoption of such products.
I'm even bad at the soap bar for my hands. I gotta say, it's terrible, but like the idea, it doesn't sit with me. I think I've been too used to just getting something out and it's gone afterwards.
Yeah.
It's funny, huh? I remember they said the toothpaste, like the whole innovation didn't take off until the toothpaste manufacturer found a way to make it foam,
Mm-hmm.
because then it looked like soap, and you were like, okay, now it gets clean. Before that, like, there's no practical use case for toothpaste to be foaming. But once they got it to foam, the consumer got the idea, now my teeth are clean, and then they wanted to start adopting it. But before the foam, it was very difficult to get people to brush their teeth.
And you see this also like for all the laundry products, for example, now. And they say, to be more sustainable, we do higher concentration, so you need to put less product.
Mm-hmm.
But people just end up putting the same amount because they're afraid that the laundry will not be as clean or not smell as good if they put less. So they end up putting something in a way higher concentration in the same quantity,
Mm-hmm.
which ends up having like really the opposite effect than what was initially intended. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yann, what has happened since you first started working on this problem all the way back in Clarion? Like, things must have changed in the last 5 or so years, right? Like, what's the biggest waves or differences you've seen?
A lot. A lot. I think like the general awareness in the market has changed.
Mm-hmm.
I think we were a bit too early in the market initially, in terms of how people were doing business, the value they were seeing in digital, and they were like a lot of business was taking place in physical fairs or through like office visits and so on. So people were not ready to move like to a digital platform. COVID helped a lot. But then a lot of people applied the same logic to the digital world than what they were used to in the physical world. So there was also a question of adapting a bit the ways of working. A lot of people were seeing digital and physical conflict when they are actually mostly complementing each other. There was also a lot of people not understanding how you will not find a one-stop shop that does it all perfectly, at
Mm-hmm.
least not today. So this idea that if we go with you, it's going to be only you and not your competitors. And now people start to realize that it's more of a multi-channel approach, and you should probably actually collaborate with your partners. You should probably think more in terms of integrations and really master one thing. So yeah, I think like our clients really evolved a lot. The maturity of their understanding of sustainability and digital platforms, integration, digital landscape, all of this really evolved dramatically in the last 5 years. So.
What's your thoughts on blockchain for traceability?
I mean, you had a lot of buzzwords.
It was a massive thing like 3-4 years ago, right? You saw all of these blockchain systems coming out. Now we've hacked the way of data being shared, and finding out the origins of the ingredients and so on. Like, where's that today? What's your thoughts on that? Because I know I have some strong opinions on it, so I want to hear yours.
I mean, like the idea of you put something in the blockchain and no one can change it and it's trustworthy. My very first question is who puts the information in the blockchain in the first place?
Mm-hmm.
So, like if you talk about diamond in Botswana, can you trust the source that will put the information, that certificate in the blockchain or not? Can you link very accurately the physical good with the digital contract?
Mm-hmm.
And what is the value that it actually generates? So I think there are some use cases that can make sense, where it goes much, much faster. I could see like in the legal sector for all the contracts and so on to have a certain value. I could see that for transaction that it can go much faster.
Mm-hmm.
I think like for traceability and sustainability, I'm a bit skeptical. I think
Mm-hmm.
it makes people feel comfortable, but it doesn't address the underlying problem. And having more information doesn't help always solving the problem. So it's nice to know that the batch of tomato was collected on April 2nd in that exact field from which I have a satellite image and this exact trolley. And I mean, it's nice. But what is the actual value from it?
Mm-hmm.
What is the environmental cost of tracking all this data and filming? and how is this so much better than the previous approach? Yeah. Uh, I think that there are use cases, but many of the one we've seen don't really make sense in my view.
Yeah. Yeah, I think what I'm struggling with, and not
Mhm.
that this is supposed to be like a blockchain bashing episode, but
Yeah.
I think I'm just struggling with, it's a fine technology for having it decentralized in terms of ownership, but that's not really the problem, is it? Like the problem is, how do you get your hands on the data in the first place? Not, where do you store it, and do people have trust in that entity, essentially, which is what blockchain allows you to do. You still need somebody to provide the information, right, to some sort of system, and then it's just a question of whether it's centralized or decentralized, and that part is just hard. Like, how do you track that thing moving throughout the supply chain? Do you strap a microchip on it? Do you get all of the supply chain actors to collaborate and log that information somewhere? And then, it can be in a blockchain, it can be in a centralized system, it can be in, whatever. But, that's the problem, is the human element that's the difficult part.
Yeah. Fully agree. I mean, it's yeah. You need to try. Like every wave has been going like a lot of things, a lot of like all the new fancy words, and everyone jumping on it, and then the
Now it's
bubble
AI.
burst, and then you go back to basics.
Mm-hmm.
AI is, I mean, AI is can help a lot of things, but you need to be very specific on the application area.
Mm-hmm.
It's not going to be the panacea to all problems. And I think sometimes people have unrealistic hopes, and they hope it will allow them to not do the groundwork that is required. You were talking about data for AI. If you have shit data, then it's trash in, trash out concept. Also,
Mm-hmm.
you have fancy trash out, but it's still trash. And you had quite a few examples where the data that was provided was totally inaccurate.
Yeah.
And the more data you put in, the faster the pace of information and how people consume data and information, the harder it is to correct misinformation, to correct a perception, to correct a lot of things.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. I think the thing I like about AI these days is that it does allow you to translate communication that it's done by human, that's quite, unstructured and dirty,
Mm-hmm.
but that's how the world works today,
Mm-hmm.
especially in some parts of the supply chain. And then it allows you to structure and digitize that at scale. That aspect I like, because that means we can take all of that communication that's being done and digitize and structure that using AI, so we can analyze it.
Mm-hmm.
So that seems a bit more like, okay, now we can actually scale a digital technology that seems quite advanced throughout a physical supply chain, a manual human to human supply chain. So that's the part I like about AI. But I guess, you're right. I mean, if you provide it with trash data, you're not going to get anything out of it, right?
Yeah, I think it's like a lot of augmented professionals.
Mm-hmm.
So you can get more out of every person.
Yeah.
You can have massive gain in efficiencies in different areas.
Mm-hmm.
We're also using it in some areas, and I mean the progress, that the way some technologies or some application, the costs shrank like dramatically. And there were some project we explored like 4 or 5 years ago, and we were talking few hundred thousands for something quite narrow in scope, and now we can do it actually quite cheap. So from this perspective, it's fantastic. But
Mm-hmm.
I think it's always like you have a very quick adoption at the beginning, and people inflate the potential of it, and then you somehow go back to basics and say, okay, it holds a lot of potential, but you need to utilize it properly, and it's not going to do everything, but it's going to do a few things really, really well.
100%. Yeah, and this is super interesting. We're running out of time, unfortunately, but there's one last question I want to ask you.
Have it.
So, if you want to leave the listener with some piece of advice on how to get started, redesigning their products around sustainability, what would that be?
I think what is important is to do something that is really, important to you. So it's important to be true to yourself, understand what is this one or two things that you want to really be excellent with, and then focus on those, and not try to boil the ocean. And then you can always extend the scope. But sometimes I think people can quickly get overwhelmed saying, oh, I can optimize supply chain, I can optimize ingredient sourcing, I can optimize the way I compensate for it. I can optimize the process, cold versus heat process. I can optimize a lot of things. And they end up optimizing none of them because they're a bit overwhelmed with possibilities. And so I think it's like being a founder. Ultimately, you need to find one thing, do it really well, and then gradually then expand the scope rather than try to start by boiling the ocean and not ultimately doing any of these properly.
And how do you find that one thing when it comes to product design?
I mean, you can have a very analytical approach of saying, I'm looking at which part of the process has the biggest impact, and then I optimize this one thing. And then once this is improved, I find the next one, and then I gradually, try to cover the full value chain. You can have a more emotional approach of saying, this is one thing that is really important to me. I'm a diver, and I see plastic in every single dive in beautiful places in Indonesia, and this is something that runs me crazy. So removing microplastics and having recycled packaging is very important to me. And then again, it's something you can identify with and you can make more central to your product design. At the end, I don't think there is a good or bad. I think it's important that people are fully aligned with what they're doing. It's
awesome.
For me, it's mostly about being very authentic in what you do, rather than doing things for the wrong reason, just because you think, it will help me sell, or because that's what people want me to do. And because I don't think you can do something really well if you do it for the wrong reason.
And I think that probably especially applies in the product, kind of consumer product design space, because at the end of the day, that's your brand. It's all about authenticity, right? Whereas, I work a little bit further back in the supply chain. It's a bit more professionalized. So there we're typically quite analytical. We're like, okay, what's the material, items here? Okay, this is the biggest one. So that's where we prioritize, but a consumer doesn't think like that. So I like that it's all about authenticity.
Yeah. I mean, in B2B, people are much more data driven, and they will not, that they see it a lot, like also in marketplaces. It's not because it's convenient that companies will be willing to pay. They are much more aware of the opportunity cost. So even if it's painful, they will go through the painful way if it helps save a bit of money. While consumers are much more about this single click experience, that convenience and so on. So you definitely see a very different approach in the B2B and the B2C environments.
Fantastic. Yann, this was super interesting. So thank you so much for coming on Next Frontier.
It was a pleasure. All the best. And talk to you very soon.
Absolutely. Will do, Yann. Thank you.
Day. Bye, Thomas.
If you're still here, then first of all, thank you so much for listening. If you've got thoughts about this episode or what you'd like to hear more of, you can email us at thomas@nextfrontier.earth. We really do read every email. You can also hit me up directly on LinkedIn. Just search for Thomas Buch Andersen. That's Thomas Buch Andersen. If you feel like it, please share with your friends and subscribe wherever you listen to our podcast. We also have a YouTube channel. It's on @NextFrontierEarth if you want to see what we actually look like in person. And if you really love the show, hit us with that 5-star review. Today's episode was produced and edited by Christina Soto, and Next Frontier music is by Keyhole. See you next time.